Okay, we're getting ready to call the meeting to order. Okay, we're going to call the meeting to order at 5:09 p.m. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the May 8th, 2023 special meeting of the Richmond Rent Board. Before we begin, I would like to ask the audience, whomever is here, as a courtesy to others, we ask that you please silence your cell phones or any type of noise devices. I'm going to, also another reminder that for individuals who would like to address the board, that a request to speak card must be given to the clerk prior to the announcement of the agenda item. If you would like to speak on matters not listed on the agenda or items on the consent calendar, you must do so under the public forum item. Again, if you would like to speak on a particular item, you must file a request to speak card prior to the announcement of the item. Please refer to the Rent Board meeting agenda for the list of items, or you can refer to the provided agenda items list open for public comment, which is posted above the request to speak cards located on the table in the front of the chambers. The first item on the agenda is pledge to the flag. Please join me for a pledge of allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, justice for all. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the roll call. For the purpose of the recording, may I please get an audible roll call from Rent Board members and staff? Board Member Cantor.
Here.
Board Member Dawkins.
Present.
Board Member Guadalupe.
Here.
Board Member Height.
Here.
Executive Director Nicholas Traylor.
Present.
Deputy Director Fred Tran.
Present.
General Counsel Charles Oshanuga.
Here.
Okay, for the record, Board Member Espinosa is absent, as well as Staff Attorney Palomar Sanchez. The next item on the agenda is Statement of Conflict of Interest. Are there any? Okay, hearing none. The next item on the agenda is agenda review. Are there any changes to the agenda? Are there any changes from board members or staff?
No changes from
No
staff.
changes? Okay. Okay, hearing none. The next item on the agenda is welcome and introductions.
Hello, board members. Nicholas Traylor, Executive Director. Welcome to the Richmond Rent Program. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on what the powers and duties of the Rent Board are. So we're going to receive some trainings. Because this is a new board, it'd be great to introduce the board to each other and to the public. So if we can have each board member introduce themselves, and then that would be great. And then, of course, staff will introduce themselves as well. If we could start with you, Sarah, that'd be great.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. I grew up in San Diego, California, so Californian, just a Southern Californian. I've been in the Bay Area for about 11 years, and I've been in Richmond for the past 5. I am planning on living in Richmond for the rest of my life. No plans to leave, really committed to this city. And I am very excited to be here, and I'll pass to my right.
Jim Height. I've 23 years in Richmond. I grew up in Marin. And Richmond is a lot like Marin used to be, filled with working class families that work hard and are doing their best to raise their kids. And I'm happy to be here and thankful.
Oh, turn your mic to the right.
My name is Elaine Dawkins, and like everybody else, I'm really happy to be in Richmond. I raised my son here in the last century, 19 whatever. He graduated high school in 1989. And then I left to go back to the Midwest, where I am from, so stayed in Cleveland and Chicago. And then when my son called one day and said, "Mom, we're pregnant. Quit your job. Come to California and babysit." So here I am for my second time living in Richmond. And this time I've been here 10 years, almost exactly. And I'm looking forward to the process here on the rent board and learning a lot and working with my colleagues.
Hi everyone, my name is Karina, longtime Richmond resident, probably over 20 years now. Originally a Mexican immigrant and have been an actual renter for the past 10 years. So I'm excited to learn the processes and yeah, support in any way.
Okay, I think all of the board members know staff now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Except for perhaps Charles. Charles Oshinunga is our general counsel. Quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, my name is Charles Oshinuga. I'm general counsel. Been practicing law for, I don't know, maybe 14 years. Done a lot of work with rent control properties, first in San Francisco, then in Berkeley and now in Richmond. Prior to that, I was a public defender for a few years. I tried a lot of misdemeanor and felony cases, so I have a lot of trial experience, and yeah, that's about it.
Great, and as you all know, Cynthia Shaw is our board clerk.
Yes.
I'll introduce everyone else. Monica Bejarano is acting as the assistant board clerk, but she's normally the supervisor of our public information and enrollment unit, and Fred Tran is our deputy director. All right, let's go ahead and get started with the next item.
Okay. All right, thank you, Nick. The next item on the agenda is swearing in of the new board members. So everyone tonight will be sworn in. So I'm going to call your name and ask you to raise your right hand, okay? Charles, do you want me to say their name individually or raise them all together?
Just raise them all together.
Okay. Why don't everyone just do it at the same time, okay? And I just read it, okay? Okay. I solemnly swear, say it after me, repeat after me. I can never say that word. Solemnly swear or affirm,
I solemnly
swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
That I
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of
California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith
that I will bear true faith
and allegiance to the Constitution
and allegiance to the Constitution
of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California.
that I take this obligation freely
I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
And that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which
discharge the duties upon which
I am about to enter.
I
I'm
am
about to enter.
Yay, thank you. You're sworn in. Okay. The next item on the agenda is to elect a chair and vice chair. So, board members, do you have any nominations for a chair of the rent board? We could start with Board Member Cantor. Do you nominate someone?
Can you nominate yourself?
Yes, you can nominate yourself, and in fact, you can even take this time to discuss, with each other, who you think the best candidate would be. So probably best just to open it up for discussions.
Great. Well, I'm happy to do it if no one else wants to. I also don't have a particular need to if anyone else is like gunning for it.
Okay, so Board Member Cantor nominates herself.
Well, I was going to nominate Jim Height for chairperson.
Yeah, I think, let me just interrupt, I'm sorry. I didn't hear Board Member Cantor, and I'm sorry I can't see you because it's plexiglass, but I didn't hear you nominate yourself, but I think what would be helpful is to discuss, and I heard what you had to say, and so that's not a nomination as far as I heard. And now I hear what Board Member Dawkins has to say. You certainly can nominate when you want, but it might just be more fruitful to talk about it before nominating somebody. But yet, when you have a discussion, you have to speak into the mic because it's public.
Well, what I was thinking,
Can you turn your mic on? I'm sorry.
Is it on
Is
or
your
you?
mic on?
Mike's on.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
I actually, what I think would be good is if you want to take the time to do all this work, I think you should be the chairman, but frankly, Elaine, I think you should be at least the vice.
Point of personal privilege. I recuse myself from either.
Oy vey. Yeah, I'm coming up on finals.
I don't have much experience, so I'm open to learning, but I would love if any of y'all want to take it, but I'm open to it as well. The chair, not the
The vice chair.
vice chair, yeah, not chair.
And I changed my nomination to Sarah.
Thank
Since
you.
Jim is having finals.
Statistics.
Oh, that's important.
Well, it's tough. Almost as bad as ordinances. Okay, I think we've reached a consensus.
Okay, so let me get this right. So Board Member Cantor nominates herself, right?
Actually,
Well,
Board Member
sorry.
Dawkins nominated me.
Okay, sorry about that. Board Member Dawkins nominated Sarah Cantor, Board Member Cantor. Board Member Guadalupe Carina, she nominated Board Member Cantor as well, right?
Yep.
Okay, and Board Member Height as well nominated Board Member Cantor, correct?
That's correct, and for vice chair, I nominate Karina.
So we're going to go there in 1 second. We're doing one at a time. Okay. Okay. So now that we've had everyone, so I take it there's no more nominations. We need to vote to close the nomination. So I need to get a motion from someone to close the nominations.
Can you actually make a motion to close the nomination and at the same time vote for the person you nominated?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So
I'd like to make a motion to close the nominations and simultaneously vote on Board Member Cantor being chair.
All right. So that's a motion as well for that. All right. And can I get a second?
I second.
Board Member Height. Okay. All right. Let me take a vote. Vote to close as well as to not elect Board Member Cantor as the board chair. Board Member Cantor.
Yes.
Board Member Dawkins.
Yes.
Board Member Guadalupe.
Yes.
And Board Member Height.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes to elect Board Member Sarah Cantor as chair with Board Member Espinoza absent. Congratulations. So now that we have a chair, I'm going to actually give you the script so you can follow with me, all right?
Okay. not chairing this meeting.
Yes,
Okay, great, I'm ready.
It's your meeting now.
Yeah.
I just take over when we don't have a chair.
Okay.
Okay, which way we going? Okay. All right, so I just left off with congratulations. You're the red.
Okay,
Okay, and the black is like directions.
okay,
Okay.
perfect. Thank you so much.
You're
Okay.
And purple, so when it's time for purple.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your trust. So now we will elect the vice chair. Board members, do you have any nominations for vice chair of the rental board?
I would like to nominate Katrina for vice chair.
Karina.
Great. Do we have a second to the nomination?
I second the nomination.
Great. Are there any additional nominations? Board member Guadalupe, will you accept the nomination?
Do I just say it? Yes, I do.
Okay, so let me get this right. So everyone voted for Board Member Guadalupe as the vice chair, right?
We had 2 nominations and board member Guadalupe accepted.
Okay, so Board Member Height voted for Guadalupe, correct?
Yes.
And Board Member Dawkins voted
So
as
there,
well?
I'm sorry, there hasn't been a vote.
Not voted, I'm sorry, not vote, I meant nomination. Not vote, sorry. Nomination for Board Member Guadalupe. Okay. All right, can I get a motion to close the nomination and to appoint, to elect Board Member Guadalupe as vice chair? Can I get a motion?
I'd like to make a motion to accept Katrina as the vice chair and bring it to a vote.
I second the motion.
Okay, Board Member Dawkins, okay, got it. Okay, let's take a vote. Board Member Chair Cantor.
Yes.
Board Member Dawkins,
Yes.
Board Member Guadalupe, well,
Yes.
Vice Chair soon, I guess, and Board Member Height.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes to elect Karina Guadalupe as Vice Chair. Motion passes with Board Member Espinosa absent.
Congratulations, Vice Chair Guadalupe.
Congratulations. All right. Do we have any public speakers? Any public speakers? No? Okay. All right. The next item on the agenda is public forum, and tonight we have no public speakers. The next item on the agenda is item I for Brown Act training.
Thank you. We will now hear the staff report.
All right, good evening, Chair Cantor and members of the Rent Board. Charles Oshanuga, General Counsel. I will be given this training. How do I control these slides? Okay. Before we begin, there are a lot of trainings on the agenda. It's going to take a while, so I do apologize. If you need a break, you can always make a motion to recess. I apologize, Chair Cantor. I can't really see you, but that's okay. I have to lean in sometimes. These trainings are for you. They're certainly not for me. I've done enough of them. And so that means if I'm speaking too fast, saying something that's confusing, or do you have general questions that pertain to the training, just feel free to stop me. You can literally interrupt me. That's what I'm here for. I kind of wanted to feel more of a Q&A, but I understand if you don't have questions, because for a lot of you, this is going to be very, very foreign. So if you're a little confused, that's okay. You can always contact me after, or like I said, you can stop me during a meeting and ask the questions you have. And, people say there's no such thing as dumb questions. I don't know. I think there are, but it's okay to ask a dumb question, so feel free. Next slide. So this is the outline of the training. We're going to speak about meetings first, then notice, public comment, and closed session. Next slide. The Brown Act, and I'm going to read from the slides. I really typically don't like doing that, but just to make sure I get all the information out, I will. I'll skip some words, paraphrase here and there, but generally I'm going to stick to the slide. So the Brown Act is a law that I'm sure you've all kind of heard about. It's actually codified in the government code. That's where you will find the Brown Act. And the Brown Act, the whole purpose really is to have transparency and to require public business to be conducted in public for the sake of public scrutiny. All right, so the Brown Act says a lot of things, but its important provisions for our training is that all meetings of a legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public unless exceptions apply, right? Next slide. So it begs the question, what's a meeting and what's a legislative body? A meeting is one that occurs whenever a majority of the members of a legislative body come together at the same time or place to hear, discuss, or deliberate on an item within its jurisdiction. And the legislative body includes any body created by formal action of the city council or other legislative bodies. This body was actually created not by city council, but by the voters. It still counts as a legislative body. So we're just gonna take that as a given. What's now important is to understand when a meeting occurs, and again, it says it occurs whenever a majority of this body comes together at the same time or place to hear, discuss, or deliberate on an action or item within its jurisdiction. Next slide. Meetings can be facilitated through direct communication, use of technology, and/or serial meetings. I will give an example about that later. But you should know that a meeting isn't limited to your physical presence in a given area. The law has since evolved as technology has evolved. Meetings oftentimes do not include individual contacts, and that's because, remember, can you go to the previous slide again, Fred? Remember, a meeting is whenever a majority of the members of the legislative body come together. So just remember that keyword majority, and also the keywords to hear, discuss, or deliberate an item within its jurisdiction, because those two keywords are really going to be the key factors in determining whether or not a meeting's has occurred. Next slide. So again, individual contacts typically aren't meetings, and that's because if board member A and B meet together at the same place and time, and they discuss items that fall within your subject matter jurisdiction, that's not going to constitute a meeting, because two members do not constitute a majority of the legislative body. So two members can't talk. They can talk about items that fall within your subject matter jurisdiction. And I say subject matter jurisdiction a lot, but that might not mean much to you all. So essentially what that means is a subject matter is anything that falls within your regulatory scope where you could foreseeably be discussing it. So the rent board is set up and created by the voters to regulate rents and evictions. That's a very broad statement. It's way more complex than that, but just to paint a very broad picture. So you will likely be discussing most things that fall into rents and or evictions. I say most things because obviously some things are not going to apply. So if you're out there, if board member A, B, and C are like best friends, or maybe you just run into each other at a grocery store or something, and housing's it's a very important issue that's in the forefront of everyone's mind in the Bay Area, and so you might run into each other and say, hey, did you see the news? And I wonder how that's going to impact Richmond. You should probably full stop there, because it's very likely that falls into your subject matter jurisdiction if it deals with rent control or evictions, especially if you're wondering of the impact it might have on Richmond. Then obviously that's going to bleed into your roles as members of the rent board. My general rule of thumb is don't talk about work outside of work, because it's kind of boring. Be interesting, be interesting people, talk about other things. Next slide.
So
Okay.
quick question.
Sure.
So if I were to invite everyone here out to eat, we should not be discussing anything rent related that has to do with Richmond.
Yeah, great question. That's an awesome, and it's a great question because of how it ended as well. So again, a meeting is when a majority of the members of this body come together and meet to hear, discuss, and talk about things that fall within your subject matter jurisdiction. Your question, yes, if you invite everyone to eat, so that you have a majority of you are there, and it's the same time and or place, which obviously you're in the same restaurant or wherever you're eating, but you're not going to talk about anything that falls within your jurisdiction, your subject matter jurisdiction, yes, you're correct. That would be okay. And what I like about the question is it's nuanced because you said subject matter jurisdiction that's pertaining to Richmond, and that's exactly right. You can talk about Oakland rent control laws. If you all got together, you want to talk about Oakland and their laws and all that stuff, or San Francisco or anywhere else, that's totally fine. That doesn't fall within your subject matter jurisdiction. You don't regulate what happens in Oakland, right? But if it's a broad issue, I always say stay away. I mean, if it's specific, did you see what happened with Oakland and they're raising this and that, that's fine. If it's a broad issue like rent control and it's broadly applied in Oakland, I say stay away from it because it's broad enough to apply to Richmond as well, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but again, if you have any, please interrupt. All right, so there are 3 kind of meetings. There's pre-meetings, post-meetings, and serial meetings. The pre-meetings kind of sound like what they are. It's a meeting that happens before this meeting. So, sometimes there might be lunch. For instance, a good example is like before these meetings, we kind of give food, right? I'm not sure our policy around that anymore. But if you're all in the back together, there's a majority of you, right? You're in the same time, same place, right? So it looks like a meeting, and it's right before this meeting. So chances people can get really, they read the agenda. There's an item that's very interesting on there. They might just blurt out something like, "Oh, did you see this?" or "Did you hear?" Please don't do that. That's a Brown Act violation. Because I am an attorney and I'm very conservative when it comes to how the law should be applied, meaning that I read it in a very strict manner. We should just avoid improprieties generally. You should even just avoid looking bad, even if you're not doing anything bad. I often tell people, in terms of the lunch or dinner situation, go 2 at a time. That can have its own problems, but you don't want the public thinking like, what are they doing back there? It's not a closed session. They've been back there for minutes, So that's a pre-meeting. The post-meeting is after this meeting, you're going to be exhausted. You might want to debrief. You might say, "Man, that training was insane. Did you understand anything?" But that would be, Brown Act violation. You can't talk about anything that's going to fall within the subject matter jurisdiction, right? So you don't want to just don't talk about work when your work's over. Just leave work here. The last kind of meetings are serial meetings. And they really deal with technology. The Brown Act really was, and you'll see this later in the later trainings, but the origin of the Brown Act really comes from like the Watergate scandal and the corruption in Washington, and it just kind of blew the country away. And so a lot of states, especially progressive states, decided to tackle those issues and try to hold government officials more accountable. And so the Brown Act is supposed to almost considered like a sunshine ordinance. It's supposed to shine light in a manner where if you're a public official, you're not conducting business in the dark. You're not doing backdoor dealings. Well, people are clever, right? And it says, the Brown Act says, remember, it's the same place or time. Majority of legislative body members meeting in the same place or time. And so people said, well, what if it's not the same place and it's not the same time? So what if I sent you an email or a text message and then you read it an hour later? We're not at the same place and we're not even communicating at the same time. So what about that, right? And people were clever, so they got around it. And the legislators, the lawmakers in California said, well, that is a big loophole. So we're gonna prohibit what we call serial meetings. Next slide. And so serial meetings are usually meetings that involve technology, but they don't have to. But it's essentially, there's 2 kinds. There's a sequential and there's a hub and spoke. Sequential meetings are when, for instance, when board member A talks to board member B, and then B talks to C, and C talks to D. So you have a majority of board members talking to each other, but it's not occurring at the same place or time. And they're obviously talking about, it's not in this example, but they would obviously have to be talking about anything that falls within their subject matter jurisdiction. That would still be a violation of the Brown Act. So if you have an item that's coming, maybe you feel a certain way about owner move-ins, for instance, and board member A wants to talk to board member B about their thoughts about an owner move-in. Well, and then board member B wants to talk to C, so they do that. Well, if C or if D has no idea who's talked to who, and D innocently talks to C because D thinks, well, owner move-ins are important, and D talks to C, well, they're all in violation despite the fact that D had no idea that C, B, and A had spoken before. So it's very important that if you've spoken to a board member about anything that falls within subject matter jurisdiction of the board, that prior to speaking to another board member, you should alert them. Hey, I've already talked to somebody about I can't talk to this. You know, my rule of thumb is, you know, if you're gonna do that, stay away from talking to anybody else. Once you've already locked in, once you talk to one person, I'm always like, that's enough. You know, everything else needs to be in public. Yeah, rule of thumb. Hub and spoke is more clear because you really do have a hub. You have one person, and everyone's speaking to that one person. So you have board member A talks to B, and then board member A talks to C, and board member A talks to D. So you can see that board member A, although B, C, and D haven't spoken with each other, they've all spoken with A, and that's a majority, and that's a problem as well. So again, it's really the responsibility of the board member who's engaged in these conversations to put their fellow members on notice that they have spoken with other people. And it just doesn't, it's not limited to board members. Remember, it's the majority of a legislative body, and the rent board is a body, so that means if you're not part of the legislative body, the Brown Act does not apply to you. So you can call, any board member can call me or Nick or anyone else, any staff member, and ask the same questions, right? That would not be a violation because we're not members, so there's no majority there. But there would be a problem if, for instance, board member A used staff to facilitate conversations between the remaining of the board members, and then staff reported back to board member A. That would obviously be a problem, because then although we weren't board members, would be acting on behalf of the board member, almost as their agent, and so then the rules of the Brown Act would be imposed on us as well. But a general rule, feel free to contact staff. It's very unlikely, I don't even think it's likely at all that you would be in a Brown Act violation. Just a note, this really is a note really to staff, but also to you all. If you send an email, sometimes we send emails out, and we usually BCC you all, so you won't know who's on the email. So when you click reply, you're just replying to a staff member. People aren't perfect. There could be a mistake where we send an email out and it's all the rent board members are listed on that, and you want to reply, you press reply all. Well, now you violate the Brown Act because you've spoken to every single every single board member about an issue that likely pertains to your functions. So that's the Brown Act. Next slide. So those are meetings. That's what you kind of want to avoid. It's practical implications. My personal opinion, it's very easy to comply with the Brown Act so long as you are always keeping in the back of your mind that the public work needs to be performed in public. And if that's your main motivator, you don't really have to know anything else about all this other complicated stuff. That's it. Okay, so we're moving on to agendas. Agendas are also part of the Brown Act. It's part of this whole transparency thing. So the Brown Act requires that we post an agenda at least 72 hours before any regularly scheduled meeting, and that's what we do. We typically do a little bit longer. We do like 5 days, 4 days, but 72 hours is a minimum. If it's a special meeting like this, it's only 24 hours that's required, but again, we usually do much longer. And we have to post it where it's freely accessible to members of the public. Next slide.
Question?
Yes.
I meant to walk through the building and go out the other door and look on the post to see our posting. Is that where we post, or do we post someplace else?
No, we typically post right where you're going to go. Right, Sydney, right outside? Yeah, it's just
so
like
our public posting right now is...
It's on the cases where they post the city council
Yeah.
agendas on the case. It's in the cases outside of the
Okay.
city hall building. Well, this civic center building.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Got it.
yeah. And then we also post, we do online. I'm sure we send it all out. But yes, we do need a post in the public area, and that's what we do. So, good question. Is this the slide, Fred? Yeah, next slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, and so the agenda has to contain a meaningful description. It has to be, the language of the agenda has to be succinctly clear and specific to alert a person of average intelligence and education whose interests are affected by the item that he or she may have reason to attend the meeting. It's a fancy way of saying it has to make sense to just the average person, And by it has to make sense, what I mean is, if the average person looked and read this, would they have a general idea of what's going to be discussed? You know, you look at our agenda item, and it could be broad. I'm usually telling people, do it broad, because if you do your language specific and it's really, really narrowed, you're very limited in what you can discuss at that meeting. It better be within the confines of what you said you were going to talk about. If you look at our agenda item, for instance, you know, Brown Act training, that's very broad. If I read that, I would think he's going to train on the Brown Act and everything that, you know, the Brown Act implicates, right? But if I start talking about the maintenance of net operating income or regulations during this meeting, there's no way a person who had read this agenda would know that I was going to speak about that, right? So any discussion of that kind, of that sort, would be a violation of the Brown Act, because clearly it goes outside the scope of the agenda language. And last thing about agenda items for this slide is that members of the public are allowed to speak on all items, but we are allowed to limit the time, and we typically do. I think it's 2 minutes per speaker. If it's a lot of, when I was a city attorney once in San Jose, and we were doing rent control, adopting or not adopting, but amending our existing rent control ordinance and adopting just cause and all that stuff. And there were, I think there was like 300 people, 400 speakers. It was crazy, and it lasted for like 2 a.m. and we had to limit the speaking time to 30 seconds. I've never seen it before, but you can limit it to, it has to be only in the most, you know, justifiable circumstances. But the court does not like limits that are egregious, like 30 seconds. You better have a very good justification for that limitation. And there we did, because, you know, 300-400 people, 2 minutes per person, you're never gonna get to your item. So, next slide. And this is kind of what I just spoke about before, that you're gonna have people being able to speak on items. They can talk about any item, really. They can talk about any item of interest that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. And what that means is the public is not just limited to speaking about items that are on your agenda. During open forum, they can speak about anything that might touch upon your subject matter jurisdiction, or they can speak on a specific item that's on your agenda. Next slide.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is this the only way the public can communicate with us, is speaking here? I mean, there's no way for them to write a long letter or something, send it in and have it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, this is not the only way the public can speak with you all. That you're going to have, if you haven't already, you're going to be assigned Richmond emails, and the public can either email you directly and tell you their concerns, or they can email us. And what we do is, when we receive their emails, we put it in an agenda packet for you all to see at your following meeting. If it's directly directed to a specific board member, which I rarely see, I've seen it sometimes, we forward that email along to the specific board member, and we agendize it so that every other board member can see what was emailed. But yeah, generally it's just a general, it's a comment on an item that's coming before the rep board. The public will email us about that, and then we will agendize. We'll make sure that email is part of the agenda so that you can all see it.
Do we do anything about their comments when they're making comments? We just listen, right? And then their time is up and they sit down and the next person comes up.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Yeah, 99.9% of the time, you just listen, and they sit down and the next comment comes up. Typically, if they make a comment that's managerial, that has something to do with staff, or like, you know, I don't know what an M&OI is, or I can't get my things filed, or XYZ, staff members here will follow up with them before they leave and make sure we get their contact information down so that we can contact them. Sometimes they raise really good points. You have a discussion on an agenda item, the public comes up, they say something that maybe you all haven't thought about, or you all haven't asked yet, and so when they all sit down and it's your turn to speak, you might say, well, I want you to address what that member of the public was speaking about, because I think it's important.
But there's no back and forth.
Oh, no, absolutely not, no. I wouldn't say absolutely not, typically not. It's extraordinary to see back and forth, but I have seen it occasionally, but usually during public hearings, which we don't have, per se, we have appeals, we don't have the public hearings, you know, like on the land use side at the city council meeting, if there's like an expert or someone who has, you know, intimate knowledge of a project, sometimes council will ask them and they will go back and forth on something, but it's very, very unusual. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Did I hear you say that that members of the public are allowed to speak on specific agenda items during open forum?
Oh, I'm sorry if I said that. No, so there's two ways you can speak to the board during a board meeting. One is during the open forum item. And during the open forum item, you can speak about anything. It doesn't have to be on the agenda as a member of the public. The second way is you specifically speak to an item. You don't do that during an open forum. You do that when the item is called and after the presentation is given, and usually after the board has done their first round of talks. And the way you do that is, as a member of the public, you fill out a public comment card, and you give it to the board clerk. And, you know, for instance, you fill out a card for item I, which is the Brown Act training. You submit that to Cynthia Shaw. And after I give my speech, and after you all ask your questions that you have, you open it up for public discussion. And then a member of the public is able to come up and say what they want to say.
So I know at council, if somebody is trying to speak to a specific agenda item during open forum, they'll be asked to stop and restrict their comments to that item. Is that the same here?
Same thing, yeah. Okay, great. All right, so why does it matter what's listed on the agenda? We've kind of already touched upon this, but essentially, if it's not on the agenda, you can't talk about it, right? And so even if it's on the agenda, if it's not broad enough, like I spoke about before, to capture what's being spoken about, we can't talk about it. All right, next slide. Now, there are very limited exceptions on when you can speak to something that's not on the agenda. I'm just going to briefly go over this. Public health and safety emergencies. So maybe there's like an impending flood or fire that's approaching here. You know, it's okay to make an announcement or something like of that matter. If you need to take an immediate action before the next regular meeting, and it just comes to your attention right now, maybe there's an emergency. I couldn't think of an example to highlight this, so I've never actually seen it happen, but that would be a justification after a 2/3 vote. And if the item is on a previous agenda and it was continued to a meeting no more than 5 days later. Next slide. So there are closed sessions. The closed sessions allow us to speak about very specific matters outside of the public's purview, but during a meeting. So we go usually back there for the closed session. I usually lead them with the executive director. And there's a list of items that can be discussed. You have to have a justification to do that, and it's very regulated. I didn't list it here because it's just a bunch of stuff that's really, really technical, and I don't think it's very helpful for you all, but you should know it's usually pertaining to a litigation or anticipated litigation, labor negotiations, or public employee evaluations. Next slide. And then there are some penalties related to violations of Brown Act. There's a misdemeanor if you've intentionally done it, and there's also civil fines and attorney's fees associated with it. It's very, very rare. I've never seen it, but I've read cases about it. In those cases, the person definitely deserves to be punished. You know, it's usually the most egregious actors. So typically the penalty is your action is voided. So if you violated the Brown Act and you took a vote on an item, your vote would be voided. If there were a bunch of you, then that entire decision would be voided. And that can have its own practical implications, right? And practical costs associated with voiding an item. But yeah, next slide. Just a reminder, like I just kind of mentioned your emails, and you're all going to be corresponding. That's one way you can speak with the public. You should know that there is something called the Public Records Act that I'm not going to get into because it was not agendized, but you should know that everything you do here, everything we generate is a public document, and with few exceptions, they must be disclosed upon request. My point being that your emails, your correspondence emails, are public records, and they will be disclosed if requested. Do not use your personal emails because then I had to dig through your personal emails, and I had to really dig through them, and I don't want to do that. And do not use your text messages. Don't use your personal phones, because then I have to dig through your text messages, and I don't want to do that. And when I mean dig, I have to go through every one of them. I don't want to do that. You don't want me to do that. So please don't do it. Just use, if you want to communicate, email. If you don't have a work phone, don't use your text. Just call or come in person. But usually, just use your work email, please. And I know it can be easy just to shoot a text to somebody, but don't do that, please. Yeah, there was a big case out of San Jose that was like, yeah, a pain. So next slide.
Charles, real quick, I just want to let them know that I am in the process of setting you all up with Gmail accounts. So now that we have everyone, you will get a Gmail account probably next week.
Thank you.
Okay, we can skip this slide. Next slide. This conflicts of interest, we can skip this because I usually train on the conflicts of interest in November and December. I usually don't go back to back, but it looks like I've decided for some unknown reason to do that. So that slide is no longer relevant. All right, so we'll talk briefly about the Rosenberg's Rules of Order. Those are the rules that you're going to use to navigate the meeting, especially the chair and the vice chair. But it applies equally to everybody else. So the purpose of the rules are to have you not feel overwhelmed by how complex a meeting can be, or like when to make a motion, or what is a motion, even. It's to help you navigate these meetings and use these rules freely, and to help you preside over meetings as well and feel comfortable about doing that. Next slide. Again, I'm not going to go over that. Next slide. So the role of the chair is the chair must understand the rules, moves the meeting and agenda, takes the lead on process, and takes a less active role in debate. And I'm sure Chair Cantor, because you've asked some questions related to the city council, I'm sure you've seen how the mayor does it, and it's usually the same thing. You usually introduce the item, you facilitate the conversation, but you take a step back, and you're usually the last person speaking. Vice chair, you have the privilege of, whenever the chair is absent, to sit as the temporary chair on that day. So it's also very important that you understand the rules and all that, the good stuff that I just spoke about. It's not that bad because it's just not that bad, you know. I mean, everyone makes mistakes, and that's okay. And I don't really think it's a mistake. You know, these are rules, but you're not going to get sued if you made the wrong motion. I'll just say, you know, vice chair, it's the wrong motion, and you'll be okay. All right, next slide. So there's a basic format for agenda items. You're seeing it right now. So each item typically like if you look at our agenda, the blue sheet, you'll see, like, I don't know, it goes from A to O. Each item, A, B, C, D, et cetera, each individual item typically follows this format. You first announce the agenda item, then you receive a report on the item. That's what I'm doing right now. After the report, there's technical questions for clarification. That's what you guys are doing right now, but you can do it afterwards as well. Typically, you don't ask questions during the presentation, but obviously this is a training, so you will ask questions. You can ask questions during the presentation generally, right? You don't really do it, but you can do it, and that's okay. But typically, board members wait to the very end for their technical questions for clarification time. So after that, there's a public comment time where the public comes up and speaks, and after the public comment's closed, then you all return to your discussion and debate, and then there's a motion. Someone does a motion, or the chair invites a motion to happen. After that motion happens, there's a second for that motion, and after we all understand the motion, there's a vote. And we do that for each action item. We do that. You're not going to do that for the Pledge of Allegiance and like roll call, but for each action item. Next slide. So in Richmond, there's a rent ordinance, and the rent ordinance requires that it takes 3 affirmative votes to make a decision on any item, to take any action. So 3 board members have to vote in the affirmative to take any action. That's important. And number 3, in most jurisdictions, including Richmond, like Richmond City Council, it's a majority of legislative body members. But it's, for some reason, whoever wrote this rent ordinance said it 3 for us. So it's not majority, it's 3. which is the majority, but it's important when we only have quorum. Quorum is the least amount of members necessary to have a meeting, and so quorum would be 3 for us. That's the smallest amount of number of board members we need to actually have a meeting. So if you have quorum, only 3, if you have basic quorum, you would need unanimous votes to take any action on any item. And that's when it becomes really important, because it's different than majority. You know, if it were just a majority, obviously you would only need 2, right? Okay, next slide. This is how we count quorum. It's counting abstain votes. I guess I'll go over this. So we count all votes as present in voting. Abstain votes are not counted, but for the purposes of quorum, they are counted. So if there's a motion and there's a second and we vote, let's say with four members here, and if 2 members abstain, right, and then the other 2 vote yes, that fails because you need 3 board members voting yes, right? For the purposes of quorum, though, we still have 4 board members. Just because you abstain doesn't mean you disappeared. There's still 4 board members here. Okay, next slide. So there's 3 kind of motions. There's a basic motion, a motion to amend, and a substitute motion. The basic motion is what you all kind of did during your nomination period just a few minutes ago, and it just introduces, it's the motion that's required to take an action on any item. Very basic. Then there's a motion to amend, and if any of you have watched a city council meeting or sat on prior boards, you know that typically people say friendly amendment. Can I make a friendly amendment to something? A friendly amendment is totally different than a motion to amend. So if board member A made a motion to change the owner move-in regulations, right? And I wasn't really satisfied with that motion. I can either request a friendly amendment from the person who made the original motion. So from board member A, I could say, board member A, can I make a friendly amendment? Can we change the regulations related to owner move-in as it applies to tenants or something like that, right? And if the board member, it's then the board member's privilege to either say yes or no. You know, if they say no, then their original motion is unchanged and you just keep going like that. If they say yes, then it's altered by my friendly amendment. There's a more aggressive way to do that, and that's to make a motion to amend. So board member A says, I want to move to change the owner move-in regulations. And I can say, I want to move to amend that motion to include the phrase as it applies to tenants. And if someone seconds that motion that I made to amend, then we first vote on that. And if it passes, then board member A's motion has been changed and altered, and it can be seconded by anybody, and then we vote on that. So it's pretty aggressive. People don't usually do that because it's aggressive, and it's kind of a waste of time sometimes because the original maker of the motion can just say, I'm going to withdraw my motion. I don't like it, you know. So it gets a little wonky. What people usually do is the substitute motion. And the substitute motion is, if I don't like what's on the ground, because let's say board member A wants to make a motion or has made a motion to change the owner move-in regulations, and I don't think we should change the owner move-in regulations, I can make a substitute motion to not change the owner move-in regulations. And if I get a second on that, what happens is we take the vote first for my substitute motion. And if my substitute motion carries, meaning it passes, we do not consider board member A's motion. It automatically defeats that motion. Does that make sense? Okay. The next slide. So the basic rule, all motions are subject to debate and or discussion, except for these motions to adjourn, which is to end the meeting. A motion to, and by the way, when I mean subject to debate, is when you make a motion before it's seconded, you can talk about that. You can talk about what's the motion and why we should or shouldn't vote for this motion and all these other good things, you know. Sometimes, like the council will, and some other jurisdictions will, if the motion gets a second, that usually cuts off debate. I'm sorry, the council will not cut off debate when the motion is seconded, they will continue to allow debate and discussion. I've seen it go both ways. It's however you want, Chair. It's your meetings. I always advise to be liberal in the way we do these things because we want to encourage discussion, but obviously time constraints and time management is also very important. So just know that you can have discussions after the second. Okay, but a motion to adjourn, if there is no debate, when someone makes that motion, there's no, let's talk about not adjourning or not adjourning. It's, do I have a second? If you have a second, you immediately vote. No discussion at all. Motion to recess is exactly what it sounds like. It's pretty much take a break. You motion to recess. You just have to state the amount of time that you want to recess for. Motion to fix the time to adjourn. It's the same thing. If you want to end the meeting at like 9, for instance, you can make a motion to end the meeting at 9. FYI, our regulations state that our meetings are only to last for 3 hours. And in order to go beyond that 3-hour mark, we need a motion to extend that time.
Does that fall under the same category of once it has a second, it goes straight to vote?
Yeah.
Motion to extend?
Yeah, thank you. There's a motion to table, and a motion to table is if you're on an item and maybe you don't want to discuss it, or maybe it's really controversial and you're not reaching a conclusion, you can motion to table that item, and what that does is it kicks it down the road. So you have to state the date that you want it to come back. Typically, motions to table are used to get rid of the item permanently, so it never comes back. Really, if you want to kick it down the road, you do a motion to continue. But you can do a motion to table and set a time limit for it to come back. If you don't set a time limit, you're just kicking it off the agenda for future. And then there's motion. Oh yes, I see a question.
I just want to be sure. All of these exceptions have to be voted on.
Yes.
So you make the motion, there's a second, then it has to be a vote.
Yes. And
then, okay.
yes, and 3 people have to vote in the affirmative for the motion to take action.
Yeah. Like if we vote to adjourn and we get the 3 votes, we'll all have to get up and walk out.
Yeah, you're done. You're finished. Yeah. And you can't just sit here and talk about how terrible that was because that's a Brown Act violation. Remember, you guys just talk about how you love your lives and then to deal with the rent board. And then finally, there's a motion to limit debate, and it's exactly what, well, it's not really what it sounds like. This is, another word for this is call to question. And maybe there's a controversial issue, and you're going back and forth, and you can't figure out the answer, but you're fed up talking to each other. You can make a motion to call the question, and immediately discussion has to stop. And someone seconds that, you vote on the motion to call the question, and then you vote on the actual thing that's on the floor. So that's it. Next line. So there are some motions that require a supermajority vote. This does not apply to you because, like I said, the rent ordinance only requires 3 and not a supermajority. So just for your general edification, if you sit on any other boards, the rules will likely require that some motions have a supermajority. Not this board, though. The next slide. Okay, and then there's this one last motion that's rarely used. It's called a motion to reconsider. It's a special motion. If there were an item that's passed and you voted for that item, and then you later realize, oh, wait, I didn't know what in the world I was voting for. You know, I guess I didn't read this thing closely enough, or maybe I didn't understand the motion that was on the floor. You can move to reconsider. And there are some rules around that. The motion has to be made during the same meeting in which that vote happened, and it can only be made by the members who voted in the affirmative for that thing that was passed. It's rarely used, but if it works, what happens is it revives that item, it undoes what your action was on that item, and then it kicks that item to the end of the calendar to be heard again by the board. Okay, next slide. Finally, there's courtesy and decorum. Obviously it's important to keep good decorum, not speaking over each other, respecting each other. There's gonna be differing views. I've done this now, 5 years maybe? I don't know, 6, 5? And I've never, and that's just this board. I sit on a rent board in Oakland, and I've done other board work, and I've never, things can get a little contentious, but I've never seen them get nasty. And so I think people generally respect each other, even though they have differing views. And especially here in Richmond, I've never seen anything that's over the top. So I expect the same from you all. You all seem to be reasonable, rational people. But reasonable people oftentimes differ, and that's okay. That's part of the reason. So just keep that in mind. Just, be courteous of each other, even if you strongly disagree on something. There's point of privileges that you can make, but I'm not going to get into any of that. These rules aren't meant to bind you in a way where you can't speak or you're speaking like a robot. They're here to help you and help you facilitate or help you move about the meeting. And so with that, I think that's the last slide of this thing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Are there any questions any further questions from members of the board? Seeing no further questions, Madam Clerk, please call the public speakers, if any.
No public speakers on this item. And there's no vote because we've received the training. Okay, the next item on the agenda is item J under conflict of interest training.
Thank you. We will now hear the staff report.
All right, thank you, members of the Rent Board. Charles Oshnuga, General Counsel. I'll be doing this item as well. Before we begin, Fred, I can't see my notes on this. Is there a way to do that or no?
Do you want the PowerPoint, the actual paper?
No, thank you.
You said yes?
No, thank you. It's okay. Let's go, Fred. It's fine. If you have any questions, there might have to be a follow-up discussion, but. Okay, next slide, Fred. All right, so the conflicts of interest are very technical. Well, before I begin, actually, do you all need a break? Because that was a long Brown Act training, and it was very heavy. And this is going to be even more heavy. So,
What about staff? You guys want to take a break?
I'm good. Yeah, I do.
I'm good.
Great.
We're only an hour in, so I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just
Thanks
check.
for the offer.
No worries, just checking.
Check with us in another hour.
All right, so yeah, this is gonna be pretty dense, pretty technical. So just a warning before we get into it. But just like the Brown Act, there's always this principle, governing principle that if you adhere to, you generally will stay within the confines of the law. So we're gonna start by talking about the Political Reform Act and the Fair Political Practices Commission. And as I was alluding to earlier about the Brown Act, it was in response to the Watergate scandal. California sought to end the corruptions in politics by reducing the amount of money spent in elections and eliminating anonymous contributions. And so in 1974, the voters amended the California's Constitution to enact the Political Reform Act. And remember, this is around the same time they did the Brown Act, so there was a lot of things happening in the 70s. So the Political Reform Act, which I'll just call the Act, it imposed strict conflicts of interest laws and requires cities and states to establish their own conflicts of interest codes. The city of Richmond does have its own conflicts of interest code. It banned anonymous contributions of $100 or more, and it placed limitations on how much money you can receive as a gift. In addition to that, the voters created the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, to enforce the act through regulations and administrative prosecutions. So it's similar to the rent board, right? You have a rent ordinance, and the rent ordinance is aimed at regulating rents and evictions in the city of Richmond and all this other stuff. And at the same time, the voters created the rent board to enforce the ordinance through regulations and administrative procedures. So same thing here. Not same thing, but analogous here. There's an act, and then there's a commission that was created to enforce that act. Next slide. So this is the order in which we're going to be discussing these issues. We're going to go with the Political Reform Act first, then fiduciary duties, the Government Code Section 1090, and then finally gifts and other ethics implications. Next slide. Okay, so the basic rule is that a public official may not make, participate in making, or in any way use or attempt to use their official position to influence a government decision when they know they have a reason when they know or they have a reason to know they have a financial disqualifying interest. So if you think you're going to make some money or lose some money off of something that comes before you all here, you should probably not be involved in that decision. Next slide. So a public official has a disqualifying financial interest if the decision will have a reasonably foreseeable material financial effect, distinguishable from the effect on the public generally, directly on you or your family or any qualifying financial interest. There's a lot of legal words there that we're going to break apart, and they're going to actually mean something in a bit. So the Fair Political Practices Commission, they employ a 4-step analysis to determine whether or not you actually have a disqualifying financial interest. And that 4-step analysis breaks apart this definition, 2 words at a time: reasonably foreseeable, what's material, and all that stuff. So next slide. So step 1, is it reasonably foreseeable that the governmental decision will have a financial effect on any of the public officials' financial interest? Next slide. All right, so one of the questions you want to ask really is, do you or your immediate family member or a business in which you are a 10% or more owner have a financial interest in the decision? And for instance, if you are a board member who is a landlord, and let's say you have a residential property in which you are an owner in, and that property, I don't know, say it's like a few units, that property is contesting whether or not it falls under the scope of rent control. So the issue comes before you all, and you are one of the board members who sit here, and you have a financial interest in that property. So you have a financial stake in that property, and the question is whether or not your property is exempt from rent control. There is a financial interest in your decision because, if you're exempt from rent control, ordinarily your equity, your property values will likely be increased because you're not being regulated by the government in that particular way. So that would be a financial interest. That means you would qualify for step 1. Doesn't mean you will be disqualified from making a decision on that item, but you are closer to being disqualified because step 1 applies to you. Likewise, if you're a tenant and your landlord owns a property with some units, or maybe just one, they rent to you, and they come before this rent board, and the issue is whether or not that property is under rent control or not, you have a financial interest, because if it's not under rent control, your rents can be raised, X amount exponentially, and that's obviously going to impact your leasehold value. So there's a financial interest there as well, meaning that you too would qualify under step 1. Doesn't mean you're disqualified from taking that action that comes before you, but it means you're closer. Next slide. Okay, again, is it reasonably foreseeable that the government decision will have a financial effect on that interest? A financial effect is presumed to be reasonably foreseeable if the financial interest is a named party / subject of a governmental decision before your agency. That's just a fancy way of saying it's really easy to tell if you have a financial interest if your name appears on the item that's coming before the board in which you sit, right? So if you're a lawyer and, you are, these examples are way easier at the council level. They're more complicated here. But yes, if you have a property and you're a landlord, you own this property, and your property is before you at the rent board, it's pretty clear that it's reasonably foreseeable that a decision around rent control is going to impact the value of your property, and so it's likely you're going to have you've satisfied step 1. But even if the financial interest is not explicitly involved in the decision, there could still be a reasonably foreseeable financial interest. And just as a general rule, if the financial effect can be recognized as a realistic possibility and more than a hypothetical, it's reasonably foreseeable. So we're not just telling you to go down the rabbit hole and think of every possible single way it can impact you financially. It has to be realistic, right? But it's read so liberally that a lot of things can qualify you under step one. Next slide. So step two, it's just not enough that you have a reasonably foreseeable financial interest. It has to be material. And material means it has to be important and or substantial, not like a penny. But sometimes a penny could be substantial and important, so it really depends on the context. And again, like I use the example, we'll see, interest involving real property that implicates materiality concerns on, okay, here's an example. And this is really on the council level, city council level, but if you're a council member and a public hearing is being conducted and a developer wants to build, some building that's really tall and it's going to be about near your property, close to your property, so it's going to block the sun from shining on your property, presumably it's going to lower your property values, and it's important to you because you love the sun. You're going to have satisfied step two. Not only just step two, which is it's material, step one, because it's probably going to lower your equity of your property because it is a building that's being built right by it. On the flip side, it doesn't always have to be negative. If you have like a cool little shopping center or something and you think it's going to attract more tourism and you own a property across the street from that thing and you think maybe I'll get more renters or I can raise my rents because the value of the land generally will increase, so you're going to make more money. You cannot make a decision. You can't vote on that item to whether or not to approve or disapprove of that development because you have a financial stake. I shouldn't say you cannot. I will say you've satisfied step one and two, so it's very likely you can't, but there's 2 steps left. And then there's the tenant one I already gave you all about the decision coming before you. I have here that interest involving leaseholds. That means if you're a tenant, they can implicate materiality where the decision would change the termination date of a lease, where it would increase or decrease the potential rental value of the property, change the legal use of the property, or impact the official's use and enjoyment of the property. Typically, if you're, a very easy example is if your landlord's here and the decision is going to impact the use of the property or impact you in some way, either negatively or positively, you probably can't vote on that item. You satisfy step two. You're closer to not being able to vote. Next slide. So step 3 is the material financial effect indistinguishable from the effect on the public generally. And that means like if a significant segment of the public will be affected by the decision and the effect on the official's interest is not unique compared to the effect on that significant segment, then it's actually okay. And you do not satisfy step 3 and you're good to go. So think about like an annual general adjustment, right? Landlords get a rent increase every year. And the board votes on that. It's ministerial, but the board still votes on that. Obviously, there's a financial effect to be able to increase your rents more, and it's material, to keep a pace with inflation or somewhat. But because the effect that it has on you is indistinguishable from the effect that it has on other rent control properties, it's not a conflict of interest because it's called the next slide. Actually, go back to the prior slide. Next slide. No, go forward. One more? Okay, thank you. It's called the public generally exception. If it affects the public generally, then typically you do not satisfy step 3 and you're okay and you're good to go. When it's more direct and individualized, then it's a problem. Next slide. And here are some examples of that exception. So there was a San Jose council member that wanted to participate in a decision relating to the city's apartment rent ordinance and Alice Act. However, she had a leasehold interest in an apartment subject to both the ordinance. So she was a tenant, right? And she was a sitting council member, and a rent ordinance and Alice ordinance came before the council for amendment. So the council member had an interest in real property since she had a lease in real property valued at $2,000 or more. What that means is that when her annual rents were $2,000 or more. Remember, this is written in 1974, so $2,000 a year was a lot of money. $2,000 now, I mean, you satisfy that threshold like in half a month for a lot of people, right, on a month. So typically, everyone's gonna satisfy step one, meaning you have a financial interest in real property if you're a tenant. So the next one is that the decision related to either the city's ordinance would have a reasonably foreseeable and material financial effect on the member's financial interest because the member's rental unit was subject to both ordinances. So however, it doesn't matter, it could be bad or good, it's gonna have some kind of effect on the finances. Finally, the member fell into the public generally exception as the amendment would impact a significant segment of renters in her jurisdictions. And all renters were impacted since the amendments would apply just generally to all leaseholds in which the ordinance applied. So that particular council member was not, did not have a conflict of interest. Next slide. And another example, in Glendale, there was a council member that wanted to participate in decisions related to the proposed adoption of the rent control ordinance. However, she had a financial interest in multi-family residential properties. So she had a business interest, and the business interest was greater than $2,000. Just take that as a given, and she owned multiple properties. The decision related to the city ordinance, the decision that related to the city's potential rent control ordinance would have a reasonably foreseeable and material financial effect on the council members' various interests because the decision of rent control would regulate or otherwise establish conditions for an activity in which her business and financial interests were implicated. It's important, obviously, if you're not in rent control and you're going to be brought in, if you're not under rent control, you're going to be brought under rent control, it's going to have a financial impact. It doesn't matter what direction it's going to be in. And finally, the council member, she met the first prong of the generally accepted, public generally exception, as the decision would have impacted at least 25% of the total residential dwellings. However, she did not meet the rest of the prongs of that exception. Because her impact would not be indistinguishable from the public writ large. She had multiple properties, multiple holdings in these properties, and her interests were really more direct. Because of her substantial investments in 2 residential properties and ownership interest in multiple properties, the cumulative effect would be greater than on a single residential unit. And so she actually satisfied step 3, which means she was pretty much disqualified from participating in the decision of whether or not rent control should come to Glendale. Next slide. Nope, I think you're slide 14 maybe? You gotta go back? Okay, step 4. Finally, is a public official participating in making, or in any way attempting to use his or her official position to influence a government decision. And it just defines what that all means. Typically, if you satisfy steps 1 through 3, you are conflicted out. But yeah, to make a decision it includes voting or authorizing someone to take an action on your behalf. And participating in a decision may include providing information or an opinion or a recommendation to members who were not conflicted out. Obviously, attempting to influence a decision includes contacting or appearing before an official in their own capacity for purposes of influencing their decision. So typically, when you satisfy 1 through 3, and I know it, or even if I don't know it, you should know it, you have to recuse yourself before the item is called, I believe. And when you recuse yourself, you actually have to leave the room and wait in the lobby, and then you come back after the item is heard. That's to minimize any kind of influence and any kind of participation. It's pretty much to insulate you from really violating step 4, because once you violate step 4, then you're done for. Next slide. So the bottom line is conflict of interest analysis is complex and highly fact specific. When in doubt, you can always contact me. I've had a few board members in the past contact me about these kind of things, some of which were very easy to resolve, some of which were very complicated. I don't share, it's a public record, so if anyone can, well, scratch that. Public records have exceptions, like an attorney legal advice. I don't have to disclose any legal advice I've given, but I just generally don't share conversations I have amongst board members. For the Brown Act reason, like we talked about earlier, the hub and spoke kind of thing. And, you confide in me about an issue you're having, a legal issue you're having, and I kind of want to have that confidence, or at least want you to have the confidence that I'm not going to go ahead and share that at all. So, next slide. And this is kind of what I was talking about, the attorney-client privilege. The privilege is with the board as an entity and the ED, but not with an individual board member. This is a very interesting concept. If if there were a legal issue and I talked to you about a legal issue and the board wanted to know what that issue was, I will have to tell the board because I don't have a attorney-client privilege with you as individuals. I have it with the board as a whole. Okay, the privilege may be waived by the board as a whole or by the ED. Typically, the board would have to vote on that in closed session. I've seen it where individual legislative body members don't care and they waive it. Very dangerous. You never do that. That's a problem. But generally, people are very respectful. I mean, it's kind of sacrosanct in that sense. People are very respectful of the privilege. The impact of receiving attorney advice. So my advice with these conflicts of interest, they're obviously there to help you and guide you. I cannot make your decision for you. When if you have a conflict, I could tell you you have a conflict, but I cannot force you to recuse yourself. And you've probably seen some meetings in your own times when you're like, that looks like that person has a conflict. Why is that person participating in that meeting? I'm sure the attorney told them they had a conflict, but that person probably just said, I don't care. The attorney can only do we cannot force you. We can only tell you what the law is. Now, the other way around, if I tell you you don't have a conflict and you sit here and you actually do have a conflict, well, for the purposes of the FPPC, which is what we just discussed, my advice does not insulate you from liability. So you can still be liable, even though you totally relied on me. You can still be liable. The only way you wouldn't be liable is if you had a direct if you receive direct advice from the FPPC themselves. So if your issue was so complicated, then I wrote a letter to the commission saying, hey, what in the world do we do here? And then the commission wrote us a letter back saying, it's fine, there's no conflict. And then there was a conflict, you'd be okay. Okay, next slide. There are other conflicts of interests, some of which are codified in California law. Next slide. Doesn't look like this. Is this the right? I'm sorry. Can this take 1 minute? So Fred, I think this might not be the right PowerPoint. Can you go into the folder and go into the item?
Okay, hold on a second. I gotta switch computers. Yeah, I pulled it from the P drive.
Yeah, is it in the folder conflicts of interest training, or is it not?
Yeah, in the separate folder.
Not the PowerPoint folder, but the actual.
Yeah.
Oh,
the actual folder.
interesting. Okay. Yeah. All right, that's fine. So I did mention we're going to talk about fiduciary duties, but for some reason I don't see it. Can you go next slide, Fred? One more slide. Huh. Okay, go back to 18. So it's not on your screen, so I'll just briefly mention there is something called a fiduciary duty. And a fiduciary is one who has the power, who is granted power to take actions on behalf of an individual or a whole. And council members and board members and public officials generally, they're fiduciaries of the public. They have to be stewards of the public. The public has granted you power to take actions on their behalf generally, right? And as a fiduciary.
It looks like it's on slide 21.
Oh, thank you. Can you go? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Strange. It's been a long day, I guess. So we'll go back to 18 later. So there are as a fiduciary, there are 5 responsibilities that come with it. And those responsibilities are called duties. So you have a duty of care, which means you're required to competently and faithfully execute your duties of the office. It's a very broad statement, I understand that, but it is meant to be broad. I mean, it means showing up on time, not missing your too many meetings, reading the material, knowing what's going on. That's a duty of care. You have a duty of loyalty, which is an absolute obligation to put the public interest before your own or any indirect personal interest. Another word, the courts usually say you cannot serve two masters. So let's say you're a lawyer and you sit on the board, and you have a client that files a petition or something with the rent board, and ultimately appeals that petition to the rent board itself. So before you, well, I mean, you can't have two interests, right? It's either you serve the client or you serve the city. And so if you were to sit on the board and make a decision in that case, you would have violated your fiduciary duty and breached your duty of loyalty. So you couldn't sit. So although technically it doesn't qualify as a financial conflict, like or it may, but it may not, as we spoke about, it certainly falls under the scope of a fiduciary duty issue. You can't have two duties. You owe your absolute obligation to the board and to the city. All right, duty of impartiality, you have to represent all constituents fairly. That makes sense. However, when in your rule, and I'll go over this in a different training, I think, in your rulemaking processes, you can lean towards whatever side you lean towards, or tenant, landlord. But in your adjudicative role, that means to say whenever you're considering appeals, you have to be impartial. It doesn't matter if you're tenant, landlord, or wherever you land, you have to be impartial. You have to take off that hat. Okay, so there's a duty of accountability, and that's kind of what we've been talking about with the Brown Act, transparency, having public meetings and all that stuff, you know. And then finally, there's a duty to preserve the public's trust in government, very broad on purpose. You just avoid impropriety. It's just that broad. It does. I mean, what does it mean? I can't get. It's almost like the entire world. You know, you can't act improperly. It's usually the catch-all phrase to catch behavior that wasn't explicitly laid out in the law. Usually, it comes. A lot of these duties are usually elicited when you're dealing with money and there's like public waste. When you're spending the public money in a way that's wasteful, or when you're doing self-dealing. When you're entering to, you're a council member or a board member and a contractor comes before you, but you own the construction firm or something. And so you're voting on your own business to line your own pockets with the money that the public gives you. That's when you would have violated something like that. Okay, back to slide 18. Thank you for letting me know that, Chair. So just real briefly, I'm not going to get into detail. I just want you all to know that there are other conflicts of interests like that are not part of the FPPC, and it's part of the government code. And it essentially prohibits elected officials and public employees from having a financial interest in any contract made by them in their official capacity. And it could also apply to your spouses or to your immediate family member. It doesn't have to be your business. It could be your partner's business or your brother's business in which, you think you're going to get kicked back, your cousins. It just avoid impropriety. People don't, even if you can justify it in court, if it looks shady, even if it's not shady, it's shady. Just stay away from it. Next slide. And then I'm not going to go over this, but there's the common law conflicts of interest. Well, I briefly already touched upon this, and this is the difference between your rulemaking and your quasi-adjudicatory roles. And again, your rulemaking is whenever you're talking about your regulations, your budgets, anything that deals with, it's everything except appeals. That's when you're doing your rulemaking. And that's really when the financial conflicts can come up. But you can lean towards one side in terms of, landlord-tenant. And then in your adjudicatory role, you have to be impartial, and that is part of our rules as well. Not only is that the law, we've also adopted that as part of our regulations, and that's Regulations 318. That's down there. I'm not going to go over, but it encapsulates everything you just heard. Next slide. Okay, and if there's a conflict, real briefly, you just disclose that conflict. You have to disclose that conflict at the board meeting. You give a brief statement. And you see under the timing, from a regulation 317, you have to disclose the conflict prior to the item, being called and discussed. And when you recuse yourself, you have to exit the chambers. And your absence, your temporary absence, is counted against quorum, meaning that if you only had 3 board members here and one has a conflict on a particular item, very likely that item cannot be heard because there would not be quorum. There would only be 2 board members. So you could hear that item, I suppose, but you couldn't take any action on that item, so it's kind of a waste of time. So if that were to happen, I'd probably advise that the item you couldn't even continue it. I'd probably advise staff to remove that item and put it on the next board meeting. And I say you couldn't continue it because you need a vote to continue, and without a majority of the board, you couldn't do it. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Talking about gifts, just again, real quick, you probably already did this with your Form 700, but you have to disclose any gift that you had received. There is a limit to the amount of money you can receive, and money is not just limited to actual dollars, it's also the value of the thing. So a gift is any payment or other benefit provided to you that confers a personal benefit for which you do not provide goods or services. It could be a rebate, a discount. I've actually personally seen wine given, and the wine was very expensive, and the person was sad, but they had to get the wine back. I mean, I told them, you gotta get the wine back. I mean, it's just a lot of money. You can't do that. Next slide. So there's a $520 gift limit for state and local officials, and this is within a calendar year. So it's all the money put together. Sorry. So disclosures: gifts aggregated $50 or more from certain sources must be disclosed on your Form 700. So there is a space there on your Form 700 that I'm sure you all filled out. If you ever receive gifts during your term, you have to disclose it if it's $50 or more. Sometimes, I'll tell you as staff, sometimes we'll get a gift from the public, or an individual member who's done a outstanding job will get a gift from the public, and you can keep the gift, or you can just put it in the common area, and if you share the gift, it's no longer considered a gift. And so you put it in the common area, and people eat it and take it and go about their day. When you retain the gift, it can become an issue. But your limit's $520. You got to disclose anything that's $50 or more on your form. Next slide. A gift can also be an honorarium. That's you get payment for any speech you've given, or articles published, or attending any public or private event. Everything that comes with that is part of the aggregate money in determining how much the value was of that thing. So if they pay for your lodging or your meals or whatever the case might be. So yeah, and typically you can't accept those kind of things at all, period. There are some exceptions, but I think in Richmond you can't add at all. Next slide. There's donations as well. These are just examples. I'm not going to go into them. I think we're at the end of our conflicts of interest rope. Next slide. There's that Form 700 that I talked about. Just remember, if you have any questions, definitely contact me. The rule of thumb that I always tell people is, if it feels shady, if it looks shady, don't do it. If you want, you might really want to sit for an item because it's really important, but if it's going to look like you have an interest, a financial interest especially, just don't do it. It's not even worth the headache of it all, and it's just one item typically. Form 700 is important. You all fill it out. April 1st, I think, annually, you have to refill it out. There's a fine if you fail to do that. It's $100, I think, escalating per month or something. But I think that's it for this presentation. Next slide. All right. So I know it was super long and dense. Apologies, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the board? All right, seeing no further questions, Madam Clerk, please call the public speakers, if any.
There are no public speakers on this item. So we can move on. There's no vote taken since we received the item, the training. The next item on the agenda is item K, under agendizing items and staff roles.
Thank you. We will now hear the staff report.
Okay, so I'm back, and this one should be a little bit more bearable. It's far, I mean, they're all practical and important, but this one's gonna really, I think, help you all out. So this is how to agendize an item and the role that the staff plays in agendizing an item. I really do think this one's really important for the things that you personally might think are really important. All right, next slide. So we're going to talk about agenda overview, and then staff agendizing items, rent board agendizing items, and then board members agendizing items. Next slide. So we already talked about an agenda. I'm going to kind of just briefly go back over it. We talked about it during the Brown Act. It's a topic of discussion that falls within the subject matter jurisdiction of the rent board, right? So anything, you can put anything on the agenda that falls within our jurisdiction. Agendizing the topic of discussion serves to notify the public of the issue and our potential action on that issue. Next slide. We're going to skip this slide because this one we've already went over during the Brown Act. It just helps us understand what kind of language needs to go in there. Next slide. And then skip that slide because obviously we know why it's important now. Okay, so how to agendize an item. There's 3 ways to do it. Staff agendizes the item. The board as a whole directs staff to include an item on the next agenda, or one of you can agendize an item. Next. So how does staff do this? So when staff has agendized an item, staff identifies an issue. That issue usually is identified through, counseling sessions, and for those of you who may not know, we have housing counselors, and so that means we have staff members who communicate with the public. The public comes in, they take a seat, and they talk about whatever issues they're going through with their on their property, and that includes landlords come in, tenants come in. We talk them through it. We give them information about their rights. Staff, they're not attorneys, so they can't advise people. We can't tell you what to do. We can only provide you information on your rights and help facilitate, help you, not enforce, but help you avail yourself to those rights. Okay, so that's one way we identify issues is through the counseling sessions. Another way is through public feedback, and then finally through staff comments and our review. So when we identify an issue, we create or adjust our policies and procedures. If we can't resolve these issues through internal adjustments, or if the issue is too pervasive and ubiquitous in the public writ large, what we do is we conclude that it requires a new rule and our regulation to handle it. Next slide. So then we do a staff report. And that's the tool by which topics for discussions are brought before the board. Typically, the staff report includes an overview, a recommended action, fiscal impact, and a brief discussion of the topic to be discussed. Staff requests the board to direct it to further explore the issue and return with policy options. So when we have a staff report, it's part of the agenda. You get it in your packet, you read through it, we give a presentation. And typically the staff report is going to ask you to take an action, usually to direct us to continue to research this issue and figure out how to solve it. Then we go back, we analyze, we research, we do outreach, we talk to stakeholders in the community to figure out how the policy or how the issue is impacting the community. And then after we shape our solutions, we return to the rent board with various policy options. And those options are ultimately translated into a regulation and rule. Next slide. And just by way of an example, I'm not going to go through it all, but the owner move-in example is an actual real example. Through our housing counseling sessions, we had a lot of people just confused. They didn't know how many owner move-ins can be done on one property. They didn't know what kind of interest a landlord had to hold, etc. And so then we went to the board, we told the board, hey, the public is having a hard time. The board directed us to figure it out. We did a lot of outreach to the public. I think we had like, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 comments. We had various, numerous meetings with the public. It took months to put this thing together. I mean, it was literally in the news. And, you know, we came back to the board with various policy options. They chose from those options to solve this issue. And then we wrote a regulation, or I wrote a regulation and rule that codified the policy options, and then the board adopted it, and we then administered and implemented it. Next slide. So that's one way you can get an item on the agenda. That's us, staff, right? Another way is you all, as a rep board as a whole, not as an individual, but as a whole. So at a conclusion of a discussion of an item that is before the rep board may direct staff to take any action that is related to the item of discussion. So if we present to you any item, it doesn't even have to have, it could just be an overview of it, and I can't think of an example, but anything that comes before you. We're definitely gonna have a recommended action, but you don't have to follow that recommended action. You can modify that recommended action, or you can just come up with your own and say, look, I want you all to come back to us in X amount of weeks, and I want you to look into these issues and bring us some policy options or something like that. And, all right, someone can make that motion, someone seconds that motion, you vote for it. If it passes, that's you giving us direction to look into certain issues that might be of concern to you all as a whole, or at least as a majority. That's one. So that's another way you can get an item agendized for the following meeting or whenever you set us to come back. Next slide. And then there's an individual board member, and I think this is probably the most important for you all, because as an individual, you might have life experiences or great ideas or bad ideas, who knows, that you might want to bring before the board for discussion, right? And staff, individual board members cannot direct staff, right? So you can't tell us to do anything individually. As a whole, you can, though, right? So individually, it's because you can't tell us what to do, but this thing might be really important to you. You might be lost. How do I get this in front of the board to then direct you to do what I want you to do, right? So there's a way to do that. As an individual, you can agendize any item that falls within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. And again, the subject matter jurisdiction are those issues that reasonably relate to rent and or evictions. Next slide. And it's generally the same steps. You identify whatever your concern is or whatever, great idea you have. You can contact us, and you can request data that supports your issues or your concerns. You can ask us to provide you a staff report template, and then you just fill in the appropriate sections of the template of the staff report. And it doesn't have to be, the staff report doesn't have to be long and complicated. It just has to be enough information there to illuminate what the issue is that you're going to talk about. And remember, it has to be broad enough to really cover everything you want to talk about. And then you just submit that completed staff report to staff, and we will help you post it. So we will agendize it for you after you submitted it to us. It's optional to prepare a PowerPoint like you've seen here. You don't have to have a PowerPoint. I've actually never seen a board member who's agendized an item themselves have a PowerPoint, so you don't have to have one. You can just give an oral presentation. Sometimes the PowerPoints are helpful, though, for people to follow along. And it's optional for staff members to do their own agenda report that goes along with yours that either opposes or supports. Staff members have never done that in the past, but just know that can be an option. Next slide. So that way you are able to, once you've done that, you get your item before the board, right? You introduce it, you give your report or your presentation, and then it follows the same schedule as it does any other item, and you can debate and discuss and figure it out. And then the board as a whole can vote on your action item. And if you're successful, that's how you get your ideas, generated, and you can use staff. Once the board has voted on your item in the affirmative, staff is now working on behalf of the board. And so that item can be better backed and hopefully accomplished. So that's it for this portion. So that was a recommended action. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the board? All right. Yeah, so for break, let's maybe first do public speakers for this item, even though I know the one.
There are no public speakers for this item.
Perfect. We have next the appeals training, and then we have the item about the budget. And so, would you all like to take a break now or wait until after the appeal training? Seem good for everyone? Okay, great. So then, let's move on to item L.
Okay. Item L is to receive the appeals training.
Thank you. We will now hear the staff report.
Yes, thank you. Charles Oshinigo, General Counsel. I'll be giving this presentation. As you can see, I was very tired when I put this last presentation together, so no fancy prints or anything like that, just straight text. Next slide. General, yeah, just straight text. General overview of appeals process. I'm going to be going over the appeals process. Again, ask me any questions you have. This one's pretty brief as well. But if it's new to you, it could be complicated. So again, feel free to ask me questions. Next slide. So there are some terms that you should be familiar with. An appeal is to seek review of a hearing examiner's decision by the rent board. And so I should probably go over the procedures. The rent board has a bunch of regulations that create processes and procedures that allow for tenants and landlords to petition on certain rights. So if a landlord wants a rent increase or a tenant is seeking a rent decrease, they file a petition. That petition is then ran through the hearings unit, and ultimately it goes before a hearing examiner. It's like a mini court, but not really. So you go into a room, a conference room, during your hearing, and you present your evidence. Both sides get to present their evidence, and there's cross-examination and witnesses, and et cetera. And at the end of your hearing, the hearing examiner writes up a decision, and that decision is mailed out to both parties. Any party that disagrees with any part of the decision can appeal, and that's where we get to appeal. So that appeal is seeking review of a hearing examiner's decision by the rent board. There's an appellant. The appellant is the party who filed the appeal, and then there's a respondent. The respondent is the party responding to the appeal or who's on the other side of the appeal. It can also get really confusing. Sometimes you can have both parties appealing. So you have an appellant and a cross appellant, and a respondent and a cross respondent, but save that for another day. There's a certain kind of reviews. There's de novo review. So when an appeal comes before you, just know for now, there's something called de novo review, which means you hear the case brand new. And I'll get into that in a bit. The word remand means to send it back to the hearing examiner. The word affirm means to confirm or ratify or approve a hearing examiner's decision. And reverse means to overturn the hearing examiner's decision. There's a record. The record means any and all evidence submitted and admitted during the hearing with the hearing examiner. And then finally the word stay, which means to put on hold. Okay, next slide. So the appeals process. You have 30 days from the date of receipt of notice of the hearing examiner's decision to appeal. There's also a 5-day, in addition to the 30 days, you have 5 days addition if we mail the appeal to you. We typically, even if we email it, we just give 35 days from the day of the decision, of the notice of decision. Next slide. So the appeal must be made on a rent program. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, about the 5 days, is that firm? I mean, is that set in concrete if a party comes in and says, oh, well, I got this 8 days after because the mail is...
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is firm. Deadlines are extremely firm, so even if you miss it by a day, your appeal would be dismissed. And again, we give 35 days And it says it on the notice of decision. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so appeals must be made on a rent program form. Whenever you do an appeal, you have to make sure you identify the specific ground your appeal is based on. And that's really important. I've received appeals that say, I appeal the rent hearing examiner's decision. Those appeals are dismissed by the rent board, like 100% of the time. And, you know, it's unfortunate because you might have had a really good case, but because you didn't actually say what you're actually appealing, you lost, right? So it's very important for the public to know, for you all to know, that the board, this is in our regulation, that the board cannot consider an appeal that fails to state specific grounds of the appeal and specific facts or arguments supporting those grounds. And that's important. When you submit an appeal, let me read this. The appeal is limited to the record and is not an opportunity to relitigate the issues unless otherwise specified by the board. Appeal and supporting documentation must be based on the record. So when you submit, yes.
On this first one, making sure to identify, do we help people who want to appeal but need some help in specifically stating something?
Yeah, you know, my understanding is if you are a constituent and you came into our office, we have housing counselors, and you said, hey, I need to figure out how to do this, we will definitely walk you through it. We can't tell you exactly what to put down because we're not advocates, but we can help you identify the issues. I'm familiar with some occasions when we had actual Spanish speakers come in and not understand exactly what's going on, and then we walked them through and broke it down for them. Again, we didn't help write their appeal, but provided them information to help navigate that process. And what's important here, a lot of things are important, but how it works is you fill out your form and you write your arguments or what have you, and after your 30 days is up or after the appeal deadline is up, it's given to me, General Counsel, to write a recommendation, which I will get into later. But it's important to state specific grounds and arguments because the board has to know what in the world you're appealing, and I have to know what in the world you're appealing, right? And I cannot engage in efficient expedition, and I cannot make arguments for you. So I have to evaluate the propriety of the hearing examiner's decision based on what you are saying. And if you are saying nothing, then there's nothing to evaluate the hearing examiner's decision on. All right, and then the second part of that, that's saying the appeal is limited to the record. Remember, the record is all the evidence that was submitted up into the hearing and during the hearing, right? So if you make an appeal, people often come here before you all on appeal, and they want to re-argue their case. They want to say the hearing examiner was wrong because I have all this great evidence and here it is. And that's not the way it works on appeal, and I'll get into that later. But it's not an opportunity to relitigate your issues unless the rent board specifies such. It's an opportunity to challenge the legal holdings and whether or not there was enough in the record, whether or not there was enough evidence in the record to support the hearing examiner's decision. That's what you're really attacking on appeal, and that's what you're considering as a board as well. Next slide. So once the appeal form is completed, they send or personally submit that form to the rent program, and then they send a copy to the other side. They responded, right? The other side, and then they said we say send a copy to the hearing examiner, but that doesn't happen. Next slide. So the respondents may respond within 15 days from the date the appeal was filed, right? So you also, as a respondent, you have an opportunity to respond. The response does not have to be on a rent program form, but it's encouraged that you use our form. And the response is obviously it's limited to the record as well. You can't relitigate your case. We've had a few parties respond, and I find it very helpful when they respond because they bring up issues that I can evaluate. Because again, I can't make up issues. Next slide. So only final decisions of the rent board are enforceable. So if a hearing examiner's decision is appealed, it is not enforceable until the rent board has heard the matter. On the flip side, if the hearing examiner is not appealed within 35 days, then the appeal deadline is closed and the hearing examiner's decision becomes the final decision of the rent board. And it's then at that time it's enforceable. So again, if you appeal within 30 days, 35 days, hearing examiner's decision is not enforceable. You gotta wait till your rent board hearing. So when, again, and I briefly alluded to this, when we receive an appeal, it gets forwarded to me, and then I prepare a recommended action to the board to either remand, which means to send it back, to modify, reverse, which means to overturn, or affirm, which means to ratify or confirm the hearing examiner's decision. Next slide. So the general structure of an appeal hearing, each party is allowed 7 minutes to present their argument. The appellant, which is the person who filed the appeal, they go first and they're given 5 minutes. The respondent, the party on the other side, argues next and is given 7 minutes. And then the appellant finally has the last word and they're given 2 minutes. If translation is required, the party shall have double the time to argue. So it becomes 10, 14, and 4. The board may allow time to any party at its discretion. But if you allow time to one side, you have to allow time to the other side, the same amount of time. And an appellant carries the burden of proof of demonstrating substantial evidence exists to overturn the hearing examiner's decision. All right, next slide. Okay, so an appeal that is not de novo. De novo means anew. Let's keep that in mind. So when you file an appeal, the standard of review is substantial evidence, and I'm going to get into that in a second, but an appeal that's not de novo, those kind of appeals must be based exclusively on the record that was before the hearing examiners, and the parties can't discuss or comment on factual matters or evidence that was not presented to the hearing examiner. So you can't talk about new evidence and any of that. You can only speak about what was before the hearing examiner. Parties may discuss legal matters and anything that's relevant to the appeal, and the board cannot consider any discussions or comments or evidence that was not in the record. So it's a big emphasis on what was in the record. And again, the record is from the day you filed all the way until your hearing was over. Everything that was accumulated during that time, that's the record, including your testimony, because testimony is evidence. So the hearing examiner records the hearing, so you have access to hear what was said at the hearing. You can consider that is part of the record. Next slide. Okay, during an appeal that's not de novo, the standard of review is substantial evidence. So what does standard of review means? It means what lens you're looking through to evaluate whether or not this appeal should be upheld or denied, all right? So what principles are you using to guide you? And that one principle you use is called substantial evidence. And that principle states that the board shall not reweigh the evidence nor second guess the factual findings of the hearing examiner, even if there was contrary evidence in the record. Instead, the board shall look only to the evidence contained in the record, which supports the prevailing party, and determine whether there exists substantial evidence in the record to support the hearing examiner's finding. So that's a fancy way of saying you cannot second guess the factual findings of the hearing examiner. If they found something factual happened, even if there's contrary evidence, it doesn't matter. You have to rely on on those factual findings. I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe this is not really an example that's ever going to appear before the rent board, but if there was like an issue of violence and someone accused someone else of hitting them, if that examiner found that person A hit B, on appeal, you take it as a given that person A hit B, even if there's a bunch of evidence that suggests that they didn't, right? And then those are the factual findings, but you can explore what the hearing examiner relied on to arrive at that factual finding. And then you ask yourself, all the things that were relied on to arrive at that finding, is it enough to actually support that finding? If it was a statement like, oh, I saw someone slap someone, is that enough? And if it is enough, okay, that's your decision. But remember, there's something called precedent. And precedent means that your past decisions, the principles in your past decisions carry over to your current decisions. So if you find that someone seeing someone hit someone is enough, then in another case that has similar facts, that same kind of evidence has to be enough. The hitting thing is not a good example because you'll never deal with that in rent control, but it's the only thing I can think of, so apologies. But that's a standard, that's a substantial evidence standard. You don't question the factual findings, but you explore whether or not there's enough evidence in the record to support that finding. Okay. And then there's obviously questions of law. You know, if the hearing examiner just totally misapplied the law and the law doesn't say what he says it says, you're not bound by the hearing examiner's legal findings. So if he's just completely wrong on the legal findings, you can disregard it. But you are bound by the factual findings. Next slide.
But how do we know about precedent? Who tells us about that? We're all new.
Yeah,
We won't remember.
Yeah, it's a great question. So currently, we've been working on, and it should be published. Palomar Sanchez, he's another attorney in our office. He's done a great job at compiling all of our past appeals decision, and we're going to publish those soon. And that would be the database where all your precedent would be. So you would have to familiarize yourself with the prior decisions. It's a good question. Yeah, it's a great question. One last thing on this issue of substantial evidence, I think an example that's probably more relevant to what you are all doing. The factual findings can be something like rent. If the hearing examiner finds that the rent was like $1,000, but there's some evidence on the other side that suggests that it's 400 or something like that, you have to go with the 1,000. Just take it as a given that it was $1,000, unless you look underneath the sheets and you find that the hearing examiner just made it up. There's nothing in the record to suggest it was $1,000. Then obviously you overturn on that basis. Hope that makes sense. Okay, I mean it's gonna make a lot more sense when it's before you all, but just keep that in mind. And then there's a de novo question, or? Oh, no. Okay, then there's a de novo appeal hearing. So the first one we just talked about was a substantial evidence hearings, or appeal, I'm sorry. This one is a de novo appeal. A de novo appeal is a lot different. It's never happened before this board, but you should all know what it is. So when the appeal comes before the board can elect to hear the case de novo, which means to hear the matter anew. That means you're no longer bound by substantial evidence. And the consequence of that is you don't have to take the factual findings as a given, that you can allow the parties to argue as to what the factual findings should be. They're permitted to call witnesses, present evidence. They can do everything pretty much. It's a whole new hearing and it occurs before this board. But there's a reason why this has never happened. First, it's pretty extreme. Second, it's extremely time consuming because you all become the hearing examiner, right? You're doing a completely new hearing. It can take hours. And if you were to elect to hear a matter de novo, what would happen is you would continue the matter for like a month or two to allow for the parties to get their witnesses together, to get their evidence together, come back before you to have a full-blown hearing. That would take a long time. Typically, these hearings are about, on the short end, they're about an hour and a half, average. On the longer ends, they're 4 hours, 5 hours. I have the pleasure of listening to all the hearings again. So they can be sometimes twice. They can be very long. Yeah, so about an hour and a half to 2 hours would be on the short end. In the middle is about 3 hours. So yeah, we've never done de novo. Next slide. So after hearing arguments from both sides, the board takes a vote. Remember, it takes 3 board members to either affirm, modify, remand, or reverse the decision of the hearing examiner. Any decision the board reaches must be supported by written facts, written findings of facts and conclusions of law. So when I send my recommendation to you all, it's going to be very long, unfortunately, but it has to be. And it's going to have a bunch of facts in there, and it's going to have some law in there, and it's going to have a recommendation in there. If you agree with my recommendation, then that recommendation becomes your written decision and conclusions of law, and we just send it out again to the parties. Now, if you deviate from the recommendation or you disagree with it, which you are absolutely allowed to do, what that requires is that I have to write another decision that's consistent with your deviations, and then come back here and show it to you and to the parties to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and then you would have to vote to adopt that recommendation, the new one, and then we send it to the parties that way. Next slide. That's never happened, but it can always happen. Decorum, I don't have to really go over this. This is more for the parties, but sometimes it can get intense, and so always remind people to not interrupt. And it's sometimes good for the chair and vice chair. A lot of people will come here and they're nervous. Just to give them words to help calm the nerves and to help guide the process, and remind them not to interrupt each other. I like to remind people to take notes. You have a lot to say, and sometimes you hear the other side say something, you're like, that's not what happened. Well, instead of saying that out loud, just take the note and then say that when it's your time to speak. And I think that's it. Great.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any further questions from members of the board? Okay, no questions, so can we please call the public speakers, if any?
No public speakers on this item. So,
Do we have any, would anyone like to make any motions to recess, perhaps?
I'd like to make a motion to recess.
Do we have a second?
Well, I'm sorry, can you state for how long? 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
I beg your pardon?
Can you state how long you want to recess for? 5 minutes?
I make a motion for a 10-minute recess.
Great. Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Great.
Okay.
So can we please call the vote?
yes, Board Member Dawkins. Board Member Dawkins. We're taking a vote.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
Board Member, I'm calling your name. We're taking a vote to recess.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Board Member Height,
Yes.
Vice Chair Guadalupe,
Yes.
and Chair Cantor.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes to take a 10-minute recess to return at 7:25 with Board Member Espinoza absent. Okay, so we can adjourn at 7:15.
And I will call the meeting to order at 7:28 p.m.
Okay. All right. The next item on the agenda is item M1 under Rent Board as a whole. Item M1 is to receive a presentation regarding the rent program budget process and requirements for the fiscal year 2023 through 2024 rent program operating budget and corresponding rental housing fee study, and discuss scheduling a special meeting to review a preliminary proposed rent program budget and corresponding fee study for the fiscal year 2023 through 2024 budget. There are no speakers on this item.
Thank you. We will now hear the staff report.
Chair Cantor and members of the Rent Board, Nicholas Traylor, Executive Director. Fred Tran is going to be doing the presentation, but I just wanted to chime in real quick and mention that this is a high-level presentation, meaning that it's a general overview of the budget process, really general goals and priorities that are associated with the budget. And it's also an opportunity for the board to ask any questions about the budget and give us any preliminary feedback. After this meeting, we have a regular meeting on May 17th. And that's when the board will be presented the first actual proposed draft budget. We're going to try to schedule a meeting before the end of the month, and I believe on the 31st, to adopt the final budget. And just so the board knows, we have to have our budget adopted in time for us to go before the city council with a recommendation for the city council to approve the rental housing fee that funds the rent program budget. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Fred Tran, our Deputy Director.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Cantor and the members of the board. I'm Fred Tran, the Deputy Director of the Rent Program. Tonight's item is going to be the discussion of the fiscal year 2023-2024 budget and the corresponding fee study. I'll provide an overview of the budget and the fee studies process and discuss the timeline to meet the rent board requirements. Our investment in this fiscal year needs to reflect our organizational goals for fiscal year 2023-2024, which includes focusing on the development of the rent program and the community outreach. This presentation is organized in 3 parts. First, we'll review mission statement for the rent program, the program's organizational chart, and our proposed goals for the upcoming fiscal year. Next, I'll present the timeline of the rent board and city council requirements. Last, I'll describe and share the proposed scheduling that staff has prepared for the proposed budget and fee study. After receiving direction from the board, staff will answer any questions on the proposed budget and fee study. The mission of the rent program is to promote neighborhood and community stability, healthy housing, and affordability for Richmond tenants through the regulating of those landlord-tenant matters that reasonably relate to rents and evictions, while maintaining a landlord's right to a fair return. A successful staffing plan is critical to aligning our 3 program goals. The rent program is currently budgeted for 12 full-time staff and 1 administrative intern. All 12 budgeted full-time roles are currently filled. Presented is a current organizational chart of the rent program with a request of an additional office assistant. The role will primarily cover the front desk to assist landlords and tenants seeking rent program services, scheduling housing counseling appointments, processing rent increases, and termination of tenancy notices. The role is highlighted in this organizational chart in yellow. All staff members serve a variety of functions, including general management, legal duties, administrative of hearings units, billing, and registration. Each staff member also provides public information and various forms of outreach to the community in some capacity. Okay. The budget for fiscal year 2023-2024 will align all 3 goals to operate concurrently to strengthen the program. The budget options will be prepared with 3 comprehensive concepts in mind. The first is to continue to develop the rent program. The second, to improve outreach and community education efforts. And finally, a more concise focus on ensuring the short-term and long-term stability of the rent program by improving compliance. In greater detail, here are the goals corresponds to each of the broader concepts. Starting with program development, we will continue to invest in staff training and professional development to ensure staff is knowledgeable of the requirements of the rent ordinance, rent program regulations, and related state and federal laws. Next, we will continue to develop online services to file submitted property enrollments, tenancy registrations, termination of tenancy notices, and rent increase forms. Finally, we will invest in additional legal services for Richmond small property owners and tenants to address the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. For outreach, we plan to increase awareness of the rent ordinance by publicizing and distributing a comprehensive guide to rent control in Richmond and continue to develop online outreach services such as fact sheets, webinars, and podcasts related to the rent ordinance and association law. Next, expand education efforts through targeting outreach to specific groups such as, but not limited to, tenants and providers of affordable housing, realtors, monolingual Spanish-speaking households, small property owners, and problem properties, such as those with code violations. Finally, outreach. We plan to develop systems to produce notices of maximum allowable rent, including a database accessible to the public where community members can research the maximum allowable rent for a particular rental unit. The final goal is program stability and compliance. The program will provide the highest level of service to the rental community. To properly administer the highest level of service to the rental community, properly administer these services, the rent program must continually collect rental housing fees to support the necessary operations. A greater focus of the sustainability of the agency will be implemented by retaining and developing staff. Leadership will deploy staff resources in the most effective and efficient manner possible. The rent program will continue to work collaboratively with other city departments to improve rental housing inspections, rental assistance programs, enforce relocation assistance or ordinance, and collect other city fees. Finally, we will continue to develop the refined rent programs database, transitioning from using the city's tracking system database and a new program. A more efficient and effective ways to collect data will allow for more accurate billing. Per the requirements of section 11.100.060L, the Richmond Fair Rent, Just Cause for Eviction, and Homeowners Protection Ordinance, and most of the residential rental housing fees will be determined by the City Council after a recommended by the board is provided to the City Council. Prior to July 1, the Rent Board shall hold a public hearing on the proposed budget and adopt an annual budget for the ensuing fiscal year. The budget shall be funded by the residential rental housing fee. In preparation for this deadline, staff members will prepare a budget for the Rent Board's consideration and potential adoption. Presented is the budget and fee study timeline for this fiscal year. Rent program staff will present a proposed budget and fee study in May to the Rent Board to receive feedback and direction. The regular board meeting is scheduled on Wednesday, May 17th. Then a public hearing must be held for potential adoption of the budget and fee study. 10 days prior to the required public hearing, a newspaper announcement is required to be published, which is typically on a Wednesday and a Saturday. We are hoping to schedule a special meeting on May 31st, and Cynthia will contact all board members to confirm the availability on that date.
Is it okay to ask a question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which paper are we talking about? It says the paper. What paper are we talking
Oh,
about?
newspaper?
Yes.
We typically put it in the Richmond.
I think it's
Or
the
co-
Richmond County Times. I believe that's the name. It's the Richmond Times, whatever that, it's the Richmond Times, I believe. Is it the,
Usually it's the East Bay Times.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what I think.
But it can be any local newspaper. That's generally the newspaper we use.
Should we be specific which paper
Um,
or papers?
We will when we do the final,
Oh, okay. Okay.
But right now, we're just kind of giving a general, this is what
Okay,
we're gonna,
thanks.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Once the budget has been adopted by the Rent Board, the program will bring an item to the City Council for approval of the residential rental housing fee. As of now, the program staff plans to bring this item to council on June 20th. Once City Council adopts the resolution, program staff will notify the Finance Department to include the residential rental housing fee in the city's master fee schedule to begin invoicing and the collection of those fees. In accordance with the ordinance, the rent program's budget is funded by the residential rental housing fee paid by Richmond landlords. This chart contains a summary of the budgeted fees, funds expended, and the amounts collected by the program from its inception. Please note the collection efforts for the current fiscal year and past fiscal years are ongoing. In 2019, the rent program entered into an agreement with the collection service to assist with the recovery of non-current fees. The dollar amounts collected and the collection rates are expected to increase as the efforts continue throughout the year.
Do we have any data for this fiscal year, or is fiscal year 22 the most recent?
I do. Actually, I could show you the, we just finished period 9 and we're going into period 10. So I have a year-to-date that I can provide you.
Great, that'll come at the next meeting, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great, just wanted to make sure.
You'll get the, actually, next meeting, you'll get a current year-to-date with a forecasted amount through the rest of the year.
Perfect, thank you.
Absolutely. The program aims to maintain a collections rate of over 90% moving forward to assure the program is financially viable. As you can see from this chart, the existing and proposed rental housing fees in Richmond are comparable to other actively enforced jurisdictions. Presented are the rental housing fees from prior fiscal years. Staff members recommend the board continue to utilize a tiered fee approach in its determination of the fiscal year 2023-2024 rental housing fee to ensure that fees align with Section 50076 of the California Government Code. Presented in this slide is the adopted 2022-2023 budget that is available on the rent program website with the corresponding fee study. The revenues are based on the fees charged to landlords, which represent the cost to administer the rent program. The budget expenses are categorized in 3 main areas. The first category is the salaries and wages of the rent program staff. The salary amounts are based on the organizational chart that was presented earlier per each job code. The second category is the fringe benefits based on the total salaries and wages. We received the amounts from the Finance Budget Department division, who provide the actual cost of the fringe benefit amounts for retirement, healthcare, and insurance expense. The third category is professional and administrative, other operating expense, and cost pool charges. The professional administrative expenses are the contracts for legal services and consultants. The office expenses are to operate the programs that consist of supplies, postage, and equipment rental. The cost pool charge consists of city charges to general liability insurance, administrative charges, and the city center rent. All line item expenses will be described in further detail and justified in the fee study that coincides with the budget. The program continues to align revenues with costs associated to administer the program. A financial consultant hired by the board, Mr. Kevin Harper, CPA, advocated for a gradual and steady increase in fees to mirror increases in the cost of doing business. If the fees remain flat for many years, it is more likely to have landlords experience sticker shock when fees are increased significant in subsequent years. Additionally, by not raising fees in a reasonable manner consistent with program needs, the agency may find itself unable to administer all services effectively and efficiently. The minimum reserve of 18% was recommended by Kevin Harper to allow for sufficient working capital throughout the entire fiscal year. The recommended action for the rent board this evening is to receive the presentation regarding the rent program budget process and requirements for fiscal year 2022, 2023 to 2024. Rent program, operating budget, and corresponding rental housing fee, and also discuss a special meeting to review a preliminary proposed rent program budget and corresponding fee study for fiscal year 2023-2024. We are available to address any questions the rent board members may have. This concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any questions from board members? Is your mic on, Elaine?
And is my,
Great.
Yeah, please
Yeah.
speak in the mics for the record. Thank you.
sorry, I lost my place. Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask a question about budget and rental housing fee requirements. It says here, the amount of residential rental housing fee will be determined by the city council after a recommendation by the board is provided to the city council. So what we're doing here is a recommendation to the city council. Am I reading that correctly?
Not exactly. What we're doing here is adopting, or eventually adopting, the rent program budget. But tied to the rent program budget is a recommended fee to fund that budget. So once if the board adopts a particular budget and its corresponding fee, it's that fee then that goes before the city council for approval.
Okay, my concern, I guess, based, well, I'm just concerned when it says it will be determined by the city council. If we have a city council that decides on its own that it's going to add to or deduct from our recommendation, do we have any recourse?
The recourse would be to revise the budget and then come back with a fee that the city council would approve. So it would be, whether the city council wanted a lower fee, or if they said, hey, we think the rent board's fee is too low, we think you should do more, they could send it back.
Yeah, that would be nice if they said it was too low, but I was worried that they might say it's too high. That would be concerning, right?
That is a concern we've had to face every time we've gone before the city council. And in some cases, some council members or the mayor have voted against the fee. Luckily, our fee has been approved each time we've gone before the city council.
Maybe we could strategize for the future on some language that would sort of prevent them from derailing our recommendation.
Sure. I don't know if I don't know how we would do that, but I understand what you're talking about.
Any other board members have questions? I have 3 questions. So I'm going to start with my question on slide 12, since that's what we're on right now. So I am seeing 3 revenue sources, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding them all. So the first line is just the fees, that kind of relates to the top of the chart. And then the second is interests and investments. Does the rent board hold investments?
It's the actual reserve. It's typically the cash in the reserve.
Okay.
And it's the interest or the earnings from it sitting in the bank.
Great. Okay. So that's just referring to like interest on a savings account. We don't hold investments. We don't hold like mutual funds, things like that. Okay. And then revenue from collections, how is that different than fees? Are those like additional fees for when things go to collections? This is what has been received from collections. So say, for instance, the collection agency had secured some funds from a particular account that was outstanding for beyond a certain time that our program is basically collecting on. Okay.
We separate their amount that's been brought into the program because they keep a percentage.
Great, so that's basically prior year funds then that we're receiving in each specific fiscal year?
There's, say for instance, these are just round numbers,
Mhm.
but say for instance, there was a $30,000 outstanding, and the collection fee was able to bring in a portion of that, then whatever the collection fees that they brought in is put into this line item. So it's separated from the actual fees that we've collected through our normal process.
Okay, great, thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah, go for it.
The percentage that the collection agency gets, you mentioned they get a percentage, they collect and they get a percentage and give us the rest. What is their percentage, please?
I believe it's 14%.
14%?
Yes.
Okay, and that's firm, or is it negotiable every year, or what?
We can renegotiate or let the contract expire and look for a new collection agency, or put it back out for competitive bidding to find a new collection agency.
How long is our contract with the collection agency?
So if I can just, I'm sorry, these are great questions, but they might be going outside of the scope of the item.
Okay, I don't need an answer tonight, just sometime.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You can also talk to us after the meeting, too. I'm sure they're readily available, the information. But you certainly can certainly explore the numbers here, and that's why I didn't interrupt you when you were talking about the portion that they retain, because it's relevant to the numbers on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
So my next question is about the fees. And so, let's see, that's on slide 10. Slide 11. So just noticing that the fees went down slightly in fiscal year '22, was that a rent board recommendation to decrease the fees, or was that council action?
That was a rent board recommendation.
Okay, and is that just based on like economic hardship because of the times?
That was at the beginning of the pandemic,
Mhm.
and a particular board member proposed lowering the fee by $1 in light of the fact that the pandemic was underway and property owners were starting to not receive rents.
Great, thank you. And then my last question is about the proposed additional position of the office assistant. So the kind of verbal description, that's on slide 4, the verbal description, I believe, mentioned an intern, and I'm not seeing that intern on here, so I'm wondering, is like the intern position being converted to an office assistant position, or?
Actually, the intern is not on this org chart, because this org chart only has full-time permanent staff.
Great.
And interns are temporary,
Yeah.
non-benefited, so they're not included here. And on this particular org chart, it's only full-time permanent with the yellow highlighted for the proposed office assistant.
Great. I guess my question is more, do you have someone identified for that position, or would that just be kind of a new open position that anyone would be able to apply for?
This would be a competitive position that anyone could apply for.
Yeah, it'd go through the normal city recruitment process.
Great, thank you. Those are my only questions. Any?
Forgive me, I've got one more, not to be answered tonight. Who's in charge of our reserve? I mean, who moves that money? Do we have a money manager, or does the city do it, or do we do it?
It's actually, the reserves are actually held with the city. They just separate the cash accounts. So say for instance, they have multiple, they call it org numbers for the account string. And it's basically held in a cash account.
Okay,
Just through the normal city banking system.
I was only wondering because some banks are paying 0.1% and some are doing 5%. I just wanted us to get the most, so maybe later.
Yeah, actually, I'll research that.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right. Thank you. So seeing no further questions, Madam Clerk, please call the public speakers, if any.
We have no public speakers on this item.
Great. So then the recommended, so I'm going to need a little bit of help here because the recommended
Sorry, let me.
action is to receive the presentation, which I don't think we need to do by vote, and then discuss scheduling a special meeting. And I believe that that special meeting has already been scheduled. Am I correct in that, or do we?
Well,
Yes, the meeting is scheduled for May 31st.
Okay. So then is there any action needed? Any recommended action to vote on from staff?
I don't know if we need to vote on this, do we? I don't think so. We just may want to revise the language a little bit in the recommended action in that during the special meeting, we won't be reviewing a preliminary proposed budget. We'll be reviewing the final proposed budget. On the 17th is when we'll be reviewing the preliminary proposed budget.
Okay, great. So it sounds like there's no action recommended by staff. Do any other board members wish to make any motions? Okay, and I think we're done with that item.
Yeah, they just received the item, right? So that there's no formal action on this item because you received it.
Great.
And so the next item on the agenda is item N under reports of officers and scheduling.
This has been a long meeting, so I do not have any reports of officers. I'll give a more lengthy report on our activities at the next board meeting.
I have a report. I just wanted to take this moment to thank the 3 prior board members, maybe 4. I mean, Virginia and Michael and Alana and Carol Johnson. They're not here, unfortunately, but I think they were fantastic board members. Like, we've always had really fantastic board members. It's unfortunate, I didn't know that was their last day, last meeting, or else I would have thanked them in person, but I want to at least get that on the record for their service and their time. And I know this is a voluntary position. You're all here. It's almost 8 o'clock. You're probably exhausted, and it doesn't get any easier. You got to show up all the time. So, yeah, thank you for those 4 board members for their long service. Some of them of which I had to twist our arm to continue to serve, especially during the pandemic, which was very, very important for us to have continuity and flexibility and experience in that regard. So, if you eventually listen to this, I wanted to thank you, all 4 of you.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. And, okay, so I think we did it. It's not even 8 p.m. yet. Meeting adjourned at 7:58 p.m.
Great
All
job,
right, well done.
everybody. Yay, first meeting down.